Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Smith. I work for Birmingham City University and I'm part of the Agile on the Beach committee. It's my great pleasure today to welcome James Ashton from the Government Digital Service to talk about the role of Agile governance in the Government Digital Service. We'll have a 45-minute session. There'll be some opportunity for questions at the end. But without further ado, I'll hand over to James. We can welcome James, please.
I'm James Ashton. I work at the Government Digital Service, and this morning I'm here to talk about delivering governance, agile services in government in an agile way. More so to show that in non-software teams benefit from agile delivery, you need to find ways to be as disciplined as you are in software delivery. First, I thought it would be good to talk a bit about what the Government Digital Service is. Government Digital Service is a part of the Cabinet Office. It's there to help government transform digital services to be simpler, clearer, faster. It's best known perhaps for gov.uk, which won the Design Award in 2013, and the Government Digital Service came about as part of the Fox report, which asks for a revolution, not evolution, in government services. Within the Government Digital Service was the transformation programme, which ran in from March 2013 to around March 2015, and that was looking at transforming 25 key government services. Of those 25 key government services, they accounted for about 80% of all government transactions that took place. And out of those government services, a problem that came about time and time again was the governance that was in place in those services. So within the transformation programme, within GDS, a team was started to look at how do we try and solve the issue of governance for agile service delivery. And at this point, so we all try and get an understanding of, I'd perhaps like to ask some of you people here, what do you think governance means? So, anyone, what do you think governance means? You, sir?
Are you spending my money wisely?
Right. Anyone else?
I think it stifles innovation sometimes.
Right.
Can I expand documentation?
So, in the lady there?
So it's like just the formal structures that have to happen as part of large organizations that restrict what happens in Agile. So that
A bit like that. So I'll tell you what we think it means. So we think it means governance helps you deliver services using the right people at the right time in the right way. Now that's not to say the rest of the government thinks of it like that, but that's how we in the end came to think of it out. In government at the moment now, agile delivery is encapsulated in a non-agile governance container. And what does that mean exactly? Well, with the new digital service standard that's taking place in new digital services that are happening, they are being able to be delivered in this world of discoveries, alpha, beta, and live, which is the thing GDS introduced when it came out with its service standard. And at each stage of those, there are learnings happening. At each stage, you are deciding at gated stages whether or not the service will continue. With governance, at the moment, it's in a more traditional format, which is you have a big policy formation, you have a big requirements gathering, and then you have a big development process. Users aren't involved, and big decisions are being made all the time. You aren't making small decisions, and you aren't having lots of lessons being learned throughout. So as you can see there is a large mismatch between agile user-centered delivery and governance. So what we produced is governance guidance for agile user-centered delivery. This started in January of 2014 and ran until January of 2015. Started with around 3 people and it ended with around 80 people. With all things in GDS, it started with a discovery. had a discovery of around 3 people, and they were subject matter experts, including agile coaches. They spoke to users in departments, and they started by running a pilot. Out of that, an alpha governance got produced, and that included principles. And they started speaking to people in departments. And these were governance principles that were mapped against the Agile principles. You can see an example of them there. However, a conclusion couldn't be reached. Not all the team were full-time on the project. Nothing was being published. Good work was underway though, and people were trying to do things, but nothing was actually getting out. We weren't getting things into the hands of the users. So we got to April. Further subject matter experts joined, another pilot started, and I joined as a delivery manager because nothing was kind of getting out there. At this point, we realised to publish, we needed to speak to more users and what we termed as critical friends. And we identified a way to try and do this was actually to have what we called our principles workshops. These involved users of the material inside and out of government and GDS coming together and actually looking at the principles work so far. This helped build consensus needed, because as I said so far, we couldn't agree on what was actually to get out there. We identified what principles we did want to include, what potential users of the governance principles, and also what accompanying text was needed along with the principles. Because you could have a principle, but you needed to have something to accompany it. So then that got to the stage where we could actually have some governance principles. So shortly afterwards, the principles were published in a minimum viable manner. They were on a GDS blog, and where we went into the detail we could at the time. And these were the principles. They were, and they still are. Don't slow down delivery. Decisions when they're needed at the right level. Do it with the right people. Go see for yourself. Only do it if it adds value. And trust and merit. One key stakeholder in government, when we were doing this work, suggested we produce a textbook so anyone could pick it up and do Agile, and as they said, do Agile governance. On reflecting on this, we didn't feel this was Agile, and that is why we chose principles as the basis of this guidance. We felt this was actually quietly revolutionary at the time, and we didn't telegraph this, but it was a deliberate action, which was government at that point, or a part of government, was providing some guidance, some principles for guidance on how to run projects or govern projects and programs, but were deliberately not providing a textbook to follow. We were providing principles to think about as to how you should approach something. And this was a very deliberate way of doing this, because that was about being agile rather than doing something. And that was a very key point to this, because we wanted this to be principles-based and not prince-like. But there were lessons that we learned during this discovery. Other team members would have needed them, and we needed them consistently available. We needed to make changes in departments. So we didn't need to just make guidance material, we didn't need to make text, we actually needed to go into departments and change things that happened. And those were in Major Projects Authority, that was in the Treasury, that was in pilots such as in the Home Office and the Common Agricultural Policy Programme. We needed to speak to users sooner and in other ways. So after this, we moved on to our alpha phase. So at that point, our team grew during the alpha phase. And as we in the governance principles, we said we want to be doing it with the right people, some of whom can be seen here. And so we started off by doing it, we continued by having it with subject matter experts. And these were people who had experience in governance in government, but also in agile delivery, both in government and outside of government. We needed a project manager with strong leadership and a strong mandate, who was able to articulate the vision, but also provide cover for the team and to get on with work while addressing business challenges. We needed a content designer, and this was very important because as we were producing guidance material, we actually needed somebody to think about how the content was structured. Because a lot of people think they know how to write and think they know what good writing is, but that doesn't mean they do know what good writing is and they can write. So this was a very important and valuable contribution to the team. And this was also a very good questioning voice to the team. We had a visual designer on the team. So as this was guidance, there was a visual element to the guidance. This also made me learn an incredibly valuable lesson, which was about where ideas can come from for things on a team. So, and that is, ideas can come from anywhere in the team. So our visual designer, Ralph, had very little experience of agile delivery beforehand. However, he was a designer and he would question us quite rigidly as to how does this make sense, the thing that you are talking about. And when he was drawing diagrams to accompany this, he would always make us try and explain the logic of the thing we were talking about. And that gave us a lot of challenge to our thinking, and it very much improved our thinking when we were producing things, and it made me really value the addition of a designer to a team beyond including visuals, and a user researcher was vital to understand who this governance was being generated for, what the needs were, what they were saying, and how we should be meeting them. So now we had the team, we had the right people, we had to focus on publishing on a minimal viable matter product material and service manual. So the service manual is the government service design manual, for those who don't know, which is a good practice guide for how to produce digital services. And we recommend that you check it out if you're at all interested. So we have the team and we have the manual. So we now need to actually be carrying out user research. So to publish it, we carried out user research to identify topics to publish on governance. And to aid us with that, we created personas. Those personas were then used to check the backlog and content and to work out who we were creating work for and were we meeting that user need. This was a good step in actually identifying the user group we were writing for, and we hadn't actually been doing that yet before. And we have this then as a rigid objective thing to measure against. Then we took the topics from the user research and the pilots and the departments, and we generated a hypothesis of what good guidance should be and what the user need is. We then ran workshops and asked for examples of what does and what doesn't work to get good examples and guidance. The workshops were good for testing out thinking and harvesting material. The hypothesis being tested was not always one that was agreed on by the team, as lack of consensus was happening in the team at this stage about what we should be writing about and who we should be writing for. Lack of consensus ranged on issues such as whether Agile was big A or small a to what we should actually be writing about. And there was a challenge when we were writing on Agile in government, on the Agile v Waterfall, and where we were to speak to on that spectrum, Because as I pointed out in my first in one of those early diagrams, we have the established model for governance, which is a lot more along the lines of the Prince thinking, where we have these agile delivery models. So if you have people in government who have their thinking more aligned to the Prince waterfall world, where we are coming along with our agile delivery language, there is a balance as to how they can engage with what we're talking about while being consistent and also authentic about agile delivery, while also not scaring them off. And so there was always that balance between what was right and what wasn't. And that did cause a lot of back and forth and discussions. So workshops were an authoritative and objective voice of the user, and groups working with the user to point us towards what we should actually be using and where we should actually be speaking. Though still on that point of the agile and waterfall bit, it still vacillated in between the two quite a bit. So consensus started to form after a workshop on a topic, and guidance could be written for a particular topic. So we were now getting to the point of a minimum viable section material, and we tested that with potential users, such as delivery managers at GDS, and we were fortunate at GDS to have a community that we could test material with. And here we have an example of where we would print off sections that we would produce, and we would ask them to then comment on a near final version whether this would make sense for them, and they would be potential users of some of those sections. And then we published in the service manual in September, which was brilliant. So that was our minimum viable section of material. Though there were lessons that we learned during our alpha. We still weren't doing it with the right people. Organisational needs and people not being available led to lags in discussion. And also the phase of where we were with collecting material and speaking to departments meant that some of the people in the team, the skills and experience they had weren't necessarily the skills and experience we still needed in that team then on the subject matter experience side. Also, the team dynamic didn't quite work because of the mix of skills not needed. There was unclear aim and focus as time had been spent with the group of people on the team then at the beginning, with them trying to develop we hadn't spent, with the group of people that were then part of the team now at this point, they hadn't had a time developing an aim and focus. That had been spent earlier on, but as the team had developed, there hadn't been a time spent refocusing and re-identifying what the aim and focus was. So it was unclear. So there wasn't the right vision and goals now for what the team was as to how it had been. And we weren't targeting specific users and personas enough. And we didn't have the right way to check the progress of our work, and we also weren't able to check the quality of the work correctly because the content flow wasn't right, so there wasn't really, it just wasn't flowing properly. And we needed to change this. So we then entered our beta phase. So the team reduced, those who weren't available full-time, or those whose skills didn't match the team didn't continue. We restarted with a new vision and focus, and that was firstly by agreeing who we were writing for. We as a team identified our user base more clearly into core and peripheral, and we hadn't done this before. And we also really identified who prioritised our users within that core and peripheral section. So within this then, we could actually see that the sponsor and somebody at Treasury, which HMT stands for, just were actually really core and really highly prioritised for us. We actually have that as an agreed consensus as a team, which is something we haven't done before, which is really important. We also agreed on what our goals and visions were. And so we spent some time as a team, went away off-site. We agreed what our vision was: simple, effective governance for digital services. And we agreed what our goals were, along with the components of those goals. And we did this by going off as a team off-site for the afternoon. We actually went off-site to the Treasury building because that's part of, well, oddly, the Cabinet Office is based corporately in the Treasury, which is a nice building to go to for an afternoon as a team. So we went to a room in the Treasury for an afternoon. We did this as a workshop, and it was just nice to clear the air and work as a team working through these things. And it was good, and everyone at the end of the team retro, at the end of Project Retro, as we did, the team highlighted this as an important day for us because we just had that space to think, and it was really good. And it's a lovely building, if you ever get the opportunity to go into it, and we had a look around. So it was fun. So yes, we managed to, at the end of this, really clearly articulate who our users were, prioritise who our users were, and also clearly articulate what our goals were, which we really haven't done before. So with that, we were then in the position of actually being able to identify in the guidance, have a prioritised list of users, which you see along the top there. On the left-hand side of that, you will actually have a list of topics for guidance, which we had from our workshops. And then from our user research, we'd have, for each user, they'd identified which areas they'd find of highest priority. So we have our high priority users, we have the high priority topics from those users, and then we have the topics from the outputs from user research. So we're now actually able to start targeting in to the areas we can actually write about and we should be writing about, which is something we really haven't been able to do before, which has been great. So this actually started us thinking about, we really need, though, this is a change activity that we're doing, because what we're doing in departments and what we're doing with these people is we're asking them to change their behaviour. So we're giving them guidance, but we're actually asking them, we want you to start doing something differently. So you can give them material, but if the material's too much information or it's trying to change too much for them, then they may not be able to engage with it too much. And it just made us realise that this is a change model or a change behaviour activity that we're trying to engage with, which then introduced us to a word, which was ADKAR, which is a change model. And ADKAR stands for awareness of the need for change, desire to participate and support the change, knowledge on how to change, ability to implement required skills and behaviour, reinforcement to sustain the change. And the point is that you choose what you want to change, and then where that person is on the journey to change, and then you direct your output to make that change. So perhaps a more common garden explanation is, if somebody wants to ride a bike, you need to make them aware of the bike. You then need to make them desire to ride the bike. You then need to give them the knowledge to ride it. You then need to give them the ability to ride it. You then need to give them the reinforcement to ride it. What you don't do is you try and give somebody the knowledge to ride a bike and they don't even know what a bike is. So the point here is, what we're trying to do, so in government speak, what that means is, buyers in the Home Office desire governance change, so you put your energy in to move them to that point on the scale. And so what we did with this, and the way that we found this really helpful, is when we started doing our work, and when we started identifying our goals and our user stories, and you can see a goal here is so for a goal, and with our pieces of material where we started dialing in our guidance is, we would actually identify where we wanted to move a specific user on the scale of ADCAR to. So we knew with the work and the time that we had, or the ability that we had, we wouldn't necessarily be able to move them to ability, but we knew we could perhaps move them to knowledge. So we knew that we could actually we could aim for the content to be focused on providing knowledge on a particular topic, not actually moving that person to actually having the ability to do something on a particular topic. Now, you could say, well, why wouldn't you want somebody to have the ability to do something on a particular topic? Well, government departments are huge. This is a huge cultural change thing. These are people who have, for very, very good reasons, been in government departments for 10, 15 years and have had careers that have been based around following particular behaviour patterns which they have followed for very good and logical reasons. We are coming along in a short space of time and trying to advise them to change something. For us, to make them change that in a short period of time could be, and a large number of people, could be the equivalent of, coin the phrase, boiling the ocean. It just would not be possible. So for us to be giving ourselves an achievable goal, we had to actually try and do something which was achievable. So this gives us something that was achievable. And so something that was achievable here would be providing knowledge. So for this goal here, and for this part of the scale here, was providing knowledge. And this really, really helped us, because it then gave immediately agreement, consensus, and focus for the team, which it hadn't had before, because everyone on the team didn't then have a different view on a piece of material. It was, before that section of material started, everyone agreed on the ADCAR scale, where is it written to? Okay, that's fine. That also then meant where on the Agile waterfall scale, where are we writing to? That also then came into agreement as well. At this point, I'd like to thank a couple of people. This came by Mark Delgado, who was working on the team at the time, and he mentioned that it came from Mark Whiteman, who at Redgate Software. So I'd like to give both of those two people a shout out and thanks, because it really did help the team, and it was quite a boon. So I mentioned with lessons learned, one of the things was the revised publishing process. The publishing process was wrong, so we needed to revise that. So we started revising that by mapping it out on the wall, just what was what were the problems, what were the steps, and what was taking us so long at the different times. And we then actually iterated that out onto our physical wall. So along with just the stages of the Kanban board, we on the right-hand side just have the different pieces of content and which stage it was at. We then moved it from a Google Doc through to our staging site and then through to our live site. This really improved the engagement with people looking at material as well, because we noticed that the more content looked like it was live, the more it looked like something that was real, people looked at it more properly as well. So when we were in our sort of discovery and alpha stages, we've been experimenting with wikis and more Google Docs based. And at that stage, we'd had a lot less engagement, or we'd had fewer comments back. The moment something looked like gov.uk a lot more people fed back, a lot more people engaged with things. I mentioned before about major projects authority and changes elsewhere. Major projects authority is a body that checks how big projects run in government. What do I mean by big projects? Things like submarines, new nuclear power stations, major IT projects. We identified that if we are providing new governance guidance, if we are wanting that to be adopted and checked, the people who check whether things are governed correctly need to also be on board to make sure that they are happy with the new governance material as well. And we needed to make sure that they were on board in two key areas. One, with the people who are doing the checking, and two, with the material that they're using to check that with. With the people who are doing the checking, we work with them to get new assessors in from both GDS and more agile and digitally literate departments such as the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office. And two, with their material, we work with them to update their assurance guidance. So at the end of this, we were done what we considered to be done. We published the material we identified from the user research and personas in ADCAR. We iterated and republished the material from our feedback and feedback from the public, and the work with the pilots continued. The guidance went into the service manual, and we published on governing a digital service, funding a digital service, governing a scaled service, seeing progress, and assuring digital services. At GDS, you get missing patches, so we got ours, the Moose of Governance, the 6 atlas with the 6 principles. However, the eagle-eyed may actually notice it's a reindeer. So we may do try and watch that. I think that we do have lessons learned overall, and these are sort of like key things we did learn overall. You do have to approach delivery the same way as you would a software team in a non-agile team, in a non-software team. You have to have the same discipline as focus. You have to have vision, you have to have aims, you have to have goals. You have to have the right people to contribute to the team consistently and not when they can, based on demands. The design thinking is really, really important. That was a really strong lesson I learned. People think with agile delivery or even software, you get a product manager, you get a delivery manager, or a Scrum Master, agile project manager, you get software developers, and that's it. But the element of how does this all fit together, how does this all get structured, and having some design thinking in there was a really strong lesson I learned. To begin with, we focused on what we as a team learned and fitted our thinking to that. We didn't reflect on our findings enough. We had spoken to users and worked in departments, though there hadn't been much objectivity to it. We hadn't been showing our thinking to the user and then responding to that by changing to it. That was really key. The workshops and sharing with the user and critical friends really shaped our content. And so once we engaged with the user and once we engaged with critical friends, that's when we started getting that feedback loop. That's when we started changing, iterating, responding. That's when we started getting that sort of objective voice of what was right. Because up until that point, we really didn't know, and we had to iterate and change after that. ADCAR, it's brilliant. You know, you can use frameworks for help even when being agile, and ADCAR was one such framework. Guidance should make you think, not follow a process for the sake of it. That is why we chose principles-based guidance, not a textbook-based model, which you choose elements and then follow. That is not to say that, you know, with the training that takes place, and you heard this from the user research that took place, with the training that takes place for things like Prince. You are told, this is your textbook, or this is the thing you get. You choose the right elements from this textbook for how to run your project. The thing is, after a while, that all gets forgotten, and in the end, you just start choosing bits, or it all just gets chosen, and there isn't that active choice or that active thinking. It just gets done. And so if you're principles-based, if there isn't that textbook to follow, you actually actively have to decide, you actively have to think through, what am I going to do and why, if it is a principles-based guidance, and that's really important. So thank you.
Thanks, James. That's brilliant. I'm going to invite questions in a second. I just wanted to say, from the point of view of following on from Alan's session, which I know you sat in on as well, and the whole point about Conway's law, and people acting in an isolated way and producing things that were bounded by their organisational culture. You had a different set of principles through the same team? Is that what you were describing earlier in your... The team had lost focus at one point?
Yes.
Why had it lost focus? What was the...
I think it lost focus because I think it was unclear what the aim of what the work is meant to be doing at the beginning.
Right.
You would have one group of people that come in with one intention, and then you'd have another group of people come in and they hadn't necessarily collectively come together and agree this is what we were working on.
Right.
So you didn't have a group of people. You didn't have all those group of people collectively all knowing what they were all meant to be doing. That was.
They were all a bit hazy about what they were doing.
I think so. Yes. So that's why that workshop in the Treasury, where I think there were 8 of us at that point, all working together, all identifying together. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is who we're doing it for. These users. That really solidified and focused the work that was to be done.
And that refocusing time was time well spent in the
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Questions from the floor? Gentleman there, and the third row, and then 2 gentlemen here.
How are you finding? Cool. How are you finding the buy-in of this from those higher up in some of the government projects? And also, how is it sort of going forwards like a year on?
Sorry, what was the first bit of the question?
So how are those higher up in these projects in government buying into the process? And then how's the retention of these policies going forward?
So I think this was being targeted with some specific programs within government, and those who were brought into it, they did sort of acknowledge it and were quite comfortable with it for those ones. I think wider adoption, I think the point of this was we had to push out for this, and that took time and energy, and so we discreetly chose, I think, 2 departments really to be working with this, and they were receptive to it and receptive to the change for it. With regards to a year on, this finished in January with this. From one of the departments I know that were working with it, I think they made those changes and they're still comfortable with the changes that they made in relation to this, with the governance specific changes that they made. The other one, I think they also made governance changes that are aligned to the principles, and they are, again, around supporting the delivery as well. So I think those departments have had other challenges related to them as well at the moment, but I think the governance side of things, I think this governance element has not been challenged. I think they've been comfortable with that. I think there's just other bits going on, because in government at the moment they've got the spend review and other stuff going on. So it's it's hard to answer that question about how things are going on in the department without including that in the mix.
It's quite interesting. I mean, I can understand it's quite big machinery of government changes at the moment.
Yeah.
People are moving around.
So I'm not answering your question. It's just I've just sort of got in the back of my mind. There's like yes. Sorry.
Gentleman glass in the third row.
Hi James. So you must have got to see a lot of government.
Yes.
Can you paint a picture of what was the best or worst horror story how traditional governance was affecting service delivery? Good to be honest.
Worst horror story. I think there was one department and they wanted to set up a program board, I think, for just a small discrete project in one department, and they just wanted to set up a program board immediately for that. Just, that's what it says, so immediately, boom, it's like an inflatable bed. It's just like, drop it down, boom, up pops the program board. I think, in terms of the best, I think there was one department, and they really made, they went from that sort of awareness to ability quite quickly, and they did a really good job of making, and this is with outsourced suppliers. They went with outsourced suppliers and took the risk of delivery, and this is a government department owning the risk of delivery and taking that from outsourced suppliers and bringing that onto themselves and acknowledging the risk of delivery themselves. And that was a really encouraging story, because that was about acknowledging that delivery risk exists, and putting delivery risk on an external supplier just hides it. That risk is still there, and that thing will not happen at some point, and it's still going to affect the citizen or the member of the public, and it still won't happen, but all that's happening is you're just hiding it off, and you're just going to have an argument about who's going to pay for it, and there's going to be some contract wrangling, and the taxpayer will probably pay for it in the end. What actually happened is that department made huge changes and actually really bought into this and really started owning the delivery themselves, and the suppliers really bought into it and started identifying that as well. And really, that was the most heartening story I heard about that.
That's a massive cultural change.
Yeah, it was. It was really good that they owned the risk of delivery, and basically the suppliers really moved to just time and materials contracts. So they changed some of the procurement conditions and all sorts of things. So that involved changes with procurement, and it involved a lot of changes in that department where they did contracting and everything. So it was really good.
Cool. And has that practice been sustained?
I think so, yes.
Good stuff. Gentleman here with the apple and the strawberry.
Yes.
Strawberry shirt, apple
It's,
is it?
it's kind of more of a kind of friendly
Was it a beet?
fat carrot.
Is it? Okay, fat carrot, that was it. A man with a fat carrot on the front row. Doesn't sound very good, but okay.
No, thank
Yes.
you. So I'm wondering, I guess a follow-on from the previous questions is what exactly is the buy-in to the principles when they're kind of used to such a strict governance, and how much is there still, they can read the principles, and when it comes to it, when it comes to the crunch and there's a difficult decision, it is still, no, we must have a proper process and we'll tie it down for months. And, sorry, slightly aligned to that, which is how much do you get different departments saying, oh, well, of course, it's fine for you to do that with that department, our department's completely different.
The thing is, we hadn't tried this broadly across many. What we did is we started this small, and the point of this is there's a section on scaling here. So the point of this is this has to be tried on a small scale and shown to be working in one sort of section of a department, then in a wider director of a department, then in a department, and then other departments actually start using it. So it needs to sort of almost be used and replicated and then expanded out. I think it hasn't sort of been absorbed and applied, across all of government yet. What we're trying to do is each time something starts in another bit of government is, people who work in those teams, people like me, say, remember we've got this here, so you need to be telling them they need to be doing this as their governance, and each time we need to be. That's what we're trying to do as the way to try and get this adopted, and we're using that as sort of the mechanism for pushing this out now. Now this came to an end in January, as sort of the active program for this being sort of developed and delivered. It's more of a passive way that this is here as your example. We're now almost trying to have have small instances of showing it working, and then getting those small instances showing it's working to then the examples for people to have confidence to use it on other instances, and then get people within GBS and other bits of government to then be adopting it. I think it's not as direct a push as when we were working on it, though it's what is the it's what we are it's what can be done at the moment, really.
We still put it at the early adopter stage inside of it,
I think yes.
So the switch on cookies are big
Yes.
requirement.
So there's bits of one of the largest government departments by transactions, probably the largest department by government transactions, is using it on one of their largest services. Is up there, it's being used in one element of that. And so it's just people, we're just trying to push and use, but it just requires people to be switching and pushing out this.
Lady in the second row.
You mentioned quite a bit about cultural stuff and something you said about getting some questions too hard, too quickly,
Yeah.
in those teams that you worked with, what did you do actually to change the culture within those teams? Like, for example, I can imagine with a environment like that, you might have very siloed teams of developers and testers and BAs or traditional people. How did you, or if you did anything to sort of bring those people together and change the culture within those particular teams, by using stuff things like the city together or changing roles or anything like that?
In one of the pilots that we've done, I think the work that was done there was very much about agile coaches were placed in those pilots, and I think they started really by observing actually what was taking place, and then they did do things much like that, just by sitting with them, by then plans, and then by just reorientating how the teams were located. I think having more vertical type teams rather than horizontal type teams, and then I think showing how it was working. I think one of the things GDS says quite a bit is show, don't tell, and getting the buy-in from another bit of the organisation to say, just give me some people, let me do this, let me show what a small discrete agile delivery team looks like, and I'll show you how that works, and then I'll show you actually, okay, let me take a few of them, and then I'll show you how we can govern that in another way, and then let me scale that up into something bigger. And I think that is how that got approached. And one of the pilots that we're working is, you just start with that smallest thing that you can, and then show that it works okay, not to scare the people. And I think that's the thing, you get something, you find an example of something working, you give them confidence that it can work, and then you, in as small as you can, that's feasible. Find something that's small, that's feasible, and that can give them confidence of it working, and then that can then be sort of scaled in some way. And I think that was the trick really, is just get it working, find something small and get that working was the approach.